Hello and welcome to the orientation for the International Business Model Competition. The purpose of the business model competition is to reward student entrepreneurs and the process they follow in order to eliminate uncertainty in their businesses. We encourage smart entrepreneurship that identifies and tests key business assumptions, seeks input from potential customers, and makes necessary changes based on what is learned. We reward the journey, the entire process the entrepreneurs undergo. Both success and failure are considered healthy in this competition. We want to encourage original entrepreneurial ideas where mistakes are bound to be made. We do not, however, reward empty sales pitches based on untested claims, flashy teams with big-name advisors, or lofty dreams of penetrating unvalidated markets. We give preference to startups that have thoroughly researched their business, as opposed to ventures lacking in customer input. Above all, we value business models that have been consistently validated with customers throughout the process. This is the Business Model Canvas, created by Alex Osterwalder. It is one of the standard tools that every lean entrepreneur should use in order to track their progress. There are 9 sections that serve as the foundation for any business. At the beginning of their journey, an entrepreneur starts with a blank canvas. Each section is gradually filled in with unproven assumptions. But as the entrepreneur makes progress on their business and interacts with customers, these hypotheses will be replaced with the results of customer validation. Through making and testing assumptions, along with what they learn from their results, the entrepreneur will alleviate the uncertainty in their business and ultimately increase the likelihood of their success. In order to better understand this concept, we'll take a look at Zoom Park, the global champion of the 2012 competition.
I first went to the business model canvas to identify who my customer was and how I could help solve their pain. I assumed that campus parkers had a hard time finding a spot, and so if I could provide them with some sort of online reservation system, it would make it a lot easier for them. I went out to test these assumptions. I talked to over 200 customers. What they told me was that campus parking was a huge pain, and if there was some sort of online reservation system, they would definitely use it. However, as I continued to talk to my customers, I found that they had a much bigger problem that caused me to make my first major pivot. They told me what they hated even more than campus parking was event parking, because they often had to pay a lot of money and still had to park far away when they went to a sporting event or a concert or something like that. I decided to pivot and to shift my focus on event parking because it was a much bigger and more costly pain for my customers. I went back to the business model canvas with a whole new set of assumptions. I now assume that event goers might be willing to pay a little bit more if they could get a guaranteed front row parking spot when they went to events. I now needed to test these new assumptions. So I went out and talked to over 75 customers through a survey. What they told me was that not only would they pay more for a service like this, they would pay a lot more. On average, about $9 more on a $20 to $25 parking spot if they could have a guaranteed front row parking spot when they went there. I now knew that I'd found a monetizable pain, and I felt validated in this area. However, I knew I needed to now provide my customers with those parking spots they were asking for. I went to the business model canvas to come up with some new assumptions about how I could do this. I first assumed that there was people who live near event venues who had an extra space in their garage or their driveway that they might be willing to post on my site and rent out to my customers as a way to make some extra cash on the side.
Now that we've seen an example, let's look at the business model canvas in further detail. Zoom Park's founder, Ken Free, demonstrated great use of the business model canvas. Initially, he started with a blank canvas, and from his observations, made a few assumptions. He hypothesized that campus parkers will want to use an online reservation system to save time and reduce the hassle of parking. After plotting the assumptions on the canvas, he went ahead and tested them with customers. After interviewing people in his target customer group, Ken learned that although campus parking was a hassle, there was an even bigger hassle: event parking. So he pivoted out of his initial hypothesis and updated the business model canvas with what he learned from his interviews. After doing that, Ken realized that in order to satisfy his target customer segment, he would have to provide the parking spaces needed for event goers. So he made a new set of assumptions. People with extra parking spaces living nearby the event venues would be willing to rent them out. In short, Ken Free guided his audience through his business development process by plotting his most critical assumptions on the business model canvas, testing them, and reporting the results. He showed his failures as well as successes and was open about changes in his business model. We reward such candid entrepreneurship because it shows that the entrepreneur thoroughly researched the problem they are trying to solve and developed their business with the customer in mind. In order to understand the results shown on the business model canvas, we need to see the underlying details. These details can be shown through a simple scientific framework: hypothesis, test, result. In other words, the entrepreneur needs to make educated guesses about critical aspects of their business, create low-cost, rapid but reliable tests, and state their unfiltered lessons learned and plan of action for the future. During this process, we want to understand the quality and quantity of the testing that took place. To be convinced that the testing was reliable, the entrepreneur needs to get outside the building, as Steve Blank would say, and establish product-market fit by talking to real customers. During customer discovery, it is essential that the entrepreneur is interacting with the right people and enough of them. While reliable tests are crucial, it is even more important that the entrepreneur explains what they are going to do based on the new, uncovered information. The goal of customer development is not to be proven right all the time, but to gather important information that will inform the next hypothesis and test.
So our story starts with Tanner working in the hospital. He works with the technology pulse oximetry. You've all seen this. It's a little red light they put on your finger, monitors your vital signs. He found working with this day in, day out that there was a pain with it that he had experienced, and that pain was the cord. He found that patients didn't like it. He found that nurses didn't like it. It got tangled up. It got in the way. So he assumed that other nurses would feel the same way. So he went ahead to test that assumption. He thought, what if we had a wireless pulse oximeter? We could have nurses use it, and we could sell it through the hospitals. So in validating that, he went out and talked with 58 nurses. He found a really good response rate. 93% said they wanted to see this over the existing technology. However, going back to the hospital, talking with administrators, he got a very different story. This was not a pain for them. It was about money, and it wasn't cost-effective for them, and so they said no. So we learned a very valuable lesson. Your user is not always your customer. Even though we found a user that loved the idea and wanted to use it, they did not have purchasing power, and so going from the yellow, it goes back to red. It's unvalidated. So they're not our customer. We had to move on somewhere else.
Let's recap what we just saw in the video. The Owlet team made a hypothesis that nurses at a hospital would like to use wireless pulse oximetry, thus eliminating false alarms created by a tangled cord. They spoke to 58 nurses and learned that 93% of them would like wireless pulse oximetry. However, after talking to hospital administrators, they realized that administrators were more worried about costs than Owlet's solution. From this test, the entrepreneurs learned that the user is not always the customer, and more importantly, pivoted to a new customer segment. This is a good example of customer development. The Owlet team made a critical assumption, which had a major impact on their business. They created a reliable test, and they used the results of the test to update their business model and make a new set of assumptions. The testing portion was especially informative because it demonstrated that the Owlet team talked to the right people and enough of them to make a reliable conclusion. Although entrepreneurs hope to be validated in all of their assumptions, often, just like in the examples of Zoom Park and Owlet, entrepreneurs need to change their direction and make adjustments to their business model. This process is called pivoting, and it symbolizes a substantial change of their model. Many times, student competitors misuse the term pivot in their presentations to signify any change they make. However, we reward informed pivots that are supported by evidence discovered through experimentation. The entrepreneur needs to justify every pivot they make to convince us that they are really listening to customers, rather than giving up on the current assumptions and moving on to something different. Additionally, the entrepreneur can and should develop prototypes or minimum viable products to communicate their ideas to the potential customers. A good prototype is built to answer an important question that the entrepreneurs face and use to acquire customer feedback. Prototypes should have a very limited feature set, big enough to pique the interest of the customers, but not so big that it takes too much time and money to build it. A prototype could be anything, from a PowerPoint slide or a website wireframe to a physical object or a video. The prototypes should lead the entrepreneur to narrow down on the critical feature set that ultimately becomes their product or service. If all else is equal in the judging process, we turn our attention to other indicators of a successful startup. We reward startups that solve significant problems, which could be defined in terms of money or social impact. We also consider early traction, which for companies at this stage will most likely come in the form of pre-sales, letters of intent, partnerships, or contracts. Thank you for being a part of this year's International Business Model Competition.